Hello and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Hostrip and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. In today's episode, I'm talking to media composer Nainita Desai. That opening piece of music is called Dark Arts, was written by me, and is courtesy of the lovely people at Audio Socket ASX. Thanks, guys! So, what can you expect from today's chit-chat with Nainita? Well, she reveals very early on that she's a huge fan of sci-fi, and in particular is a Trekkie. I suppose in that instance I wanted to understand if she was given a choice between Star Trek and Star Wars, which she would choose. Clearly there can be only one victor. Nainita also reveals that she's a huge fan of Barbra Streisand, and as a child could often be heard belting out some of her classics. So, if you ever do manage to get Nainita into a karaoke booth, pop on a bit of Woman in Love and she'll be on the stage in a heartbeat. We talk about Nainita's fascinating journey into music, which included working as Peter Gabriel's assistant at Real World Studios. She also cites his score for The Last Temptation of Christ as being, I suppose, a seminal moment in her musical evolution. But she also worked as a Foley artist, apparently spending a lot of time chopping up cabbages. And I was very interested to explore how working as a Foley artist fed into her work as a composer. I myself love blurring the line between sound design and music, and was very interested to hear how she reconciles those two worlds. She also has an interesting theory about liberating yourself creatively by restricting your creative palette. I suppose in the modern world we have so many options available to us in terms of where we start creatively that it can sometimes be stifling. There's a paradox of choice. We have so much choice we don't know where to start, and that actually by restricting that creative palette in the first instance is often a liberating experience. We go under the skin with her score for 14 Peaks, Nothing Impossible, which is the Netflix documentary about Nimal Purja and his seemingly impossible quest to summit all 14 of the world's 8,000 metre peaks in just 7 months. And we also chat about her score for The Reason I Jump, which is an immersive documentary exploring the experiences of non-speaking autistic people around the world. Of course, it wouldn't be an episode of Sync Music Matters unless we found out about who has influenced Nainita over the years, and she talks about Ennio Morricone, Brian Eno, and Jean-Michel Jarre. So grab yourself a cup of tea and a Kit Kat, sit back and relax, and enjoy this conversation with the wonderful Nainita Desai. Nainita Desai is a multimedia composer who you might be most familiar with for her extensive work in TV and film. She's an RTS winner, a BIFA, Cinema Eye Honours and Ivor Novello nominee. She is officially a BAFTA Breakthrough Brit and was IFMCA Breakthrough Composer of 2020. Nainita's recent projects include Netflix's 14 Peaks, Nothing is Impossible, which is also an ASCAP Composer Choice nominee for the Best Documentary Score. She scored the critically acclaimed Oscar-nominated film For Sama, the Sundance-winning feature The Reason I Jump, and American Murder, The Family Next Door, which to date is Netflix's most viewed feature documentary. Nainita Desai, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Jim. Is that me?
Yes. I think it's always quite telling. I always find when I sort of read out the sort of credits, people sort of go, "Whoa, okay." It's quite rare to hear them read out loud.
Yeah, it is for me.
But it's, yeah, wonderful selection of credits. So yeah, thanks very much for joining me. The first question that I kind of like to open up with every single guest is if we were to sort of rewind to a sort of Nainita who's aged between 5 and 10. If we were to have asked you back then, what would you like to be when you grow up? What would you have replied?
Oh, good question. Well, it varies a lot between the age of 5 and 10. When I was 5, I definitely wanted to be the first female astronaut in space. I was very much into astronomy and the stars and the planets and science and all of that. My father was very much into science, and he introduced me to Star Trek. So I was a Trekkie when I was little. So that was that. And then as I grew a little bit older, I think when I was 10, I wanted to be Barbra Streisand and become a singer. a professional singer. And so at school, at primary school, I learned the violin and the piano. And then at secondary school, I had my own band, and I would sing, do Barbra Streisand covers and annoy the hell out of the 1,200 students at school assemblies and sing.
Wow. Do you still to this day sing? Can you still be heard singing Barbra Streisand covers out loud?
And maybe in the privacy of my shower.
Okay.
And house, but not in public. No. No.
Well, that seems a very natural progression, doesn't it? From intergalactic space explorer to Barbra Streisand cover act. But obviously, Barbra Streisand triggered something musically in you. How did that then sort of develop into? Was it sort of, did it morph into composing, or was there sort of other steps?
Yeah. Well, what happened was I discovered I had stage fright, sort of, as the older I was getting, and I got more and more interested. I was very much a tomboy, and I really enjoyed technology and computers, and I used to play with Meccano and cars, and so I wanted to work more behind the scenes. I got interested as a teenager. I was very interested in the visual arts, and got into cinema and photography and making films of my own as a teen, and also musically. I was self-taught on various instruments. I did learn the piano and the violin at school, and I was in various orchestras and choirs. I sang in choirs, and I had this wonderful sense of togetherness and community, being part of a whole, when you're singing in a choir. So that really opened. I went to a Church of England school, and that really opened up my eyes and ears to so many different styles of music, so many different musical genres. So then I got into, so I was very much interested in sonics, the sound of albums, and what went on behind that. So that opened up my eyes to music engineering and, the role of, there are record producers, there are music engineers. What is this world? So I got my first multi-track, 4-track recording device, and microphones and drum machines and synthesizers, and that was, got into Jean-Michel Jarre and all these synth craft work, and these that world opened up to me, and I discovered Daniel Lanois and Brian Eno, and at that time they were really, Daniel Lanois had been producing U2 and the Neville Brothers, and an incredible Bonnie Lee Raitt, and an incredible array of artists. So my musical world, my listening world, opened up through exploring the world of technology and synths and music production. And I thought, I want to be a record producer. I want to be a music engineer and work behind these huge mixing desks. And at the time studios were huge and filled with gear, and that was really magical for me. But then I was also very interested in sound and through film. So I actually started off as a sound designer on feature films, and doing it's interesting because you're working as part of a big team, and the role of audio post-production in film is broken up into all these fragmented little areas. You've got dialogues and sound effects and Foleys and atmospheres and music editing, and all those different areas are split up into different jobs handled by different people. So I worked as a freelance assistant sound editor, as it was called then, at Pinewood Studios in Shepperton and Twickenham Film Studios, where these amazing films were being made. And I sort of talked my way into an assisting job, and I got experience doing a bit of Foley, I was a Foley artist for a while as well. So, which was great, really great, because you're really just getting into recording sounds and, chopping up cabbages to substitute for people's brains exploding or something,
Yeah, classic.
Yeah, so that was a lot of fun as well. So I was a Foley artist, sound designer, dialogue editing, did all these different roles.
Yeah. And so how did that then kind of lead into writing music for film? Well,
at the time, then I decided that I couldn't get any further up the ladder from. I thought I'm too creative. I wanted to go back to my creative roots and my true first love, which is music. So I wrote a letter to Peter Gabriel, who's one of my musical heroes, and he runs this amazing recording studio complex just outside Bath called Real World, and he runs WOMAD as well, which had started up at the time. And I got invited to go down and visit Real World Studios, and I basically talked myself into being Peter's assistant music engineer. I gave up being a sound designer and thought I had to go back to grassroots again and start from scratch, if I wanted to work in music. And that was a tough, it was a big decision that I made, because I could have, was very well established as a sound editor, sound designer. So I.
And did Peter take much convincing?
Well, the studio manager interviewed me. I went down to Bath for the day, and I spent 4 hours talking to the manager, and he showed me around the whole complex. And I thought, I've got all these ideas, I can create this sound database for you, and I can, I've got all these computing skills, and, please let me help you, and they did. I came back to London, and I got a phone call a couple of weeks later, and he said, why don't you, okay, would you like to be Peter's assistant? Oh, blimey, so it was just a dream come true for me, and also working with incredible record producers and engineers like that. He'd be, Dave Bottrell, who produced, mixed and engineered Us and The Last Temptation of Christ, which was Martin Scorsese's film that Peter wrote the score for. And that was, for me, that was a seminal score at the time. So I learned so much there about working on managing people creatively, how to work with musicians and handle sessions and all that skill set that I learned and developed as a sound designer, and then in music engineering really informs how I work today and helps me today. It's just gaining this, nothing is ever lost. You learn from all these different areas. It all informed what I do today. So then I met a music supervisor, to answer your question, Jim, and we became friends, and he was looking for different composers for a Channel 4 TV show that he was supervising. And he knew that as a hobby, my day job was sort of working in engineering and sound design, but as a hobby on the side, I was writing my own music and messing around with my own studio that I was building up. And he said, look, would you like to write the music for a TV show that I'm supervising? And no one had paid me any money to write music before, even though I was just dabbling on my own. So it was baptism by fire, and I got thrown in at the deep end. And I thought, okay, yes, I'll do it. And then I thought, how do I compose music for TV? How do I compose to picture? And I'd sort of synchronize my U-matic tape machine to my computer with a synchronizer MIDI timecode synchronizer, and move frame by frame and sort of write to picture from, okay, I've got 10 bars before that changes on the screen, and then after 10 bars something else needs to happen, and so that was my process of teaching myself how to compose to picture.
Incredible. I think there's two things there which I think are fascinating. Is one, the fact that you just reached out to someone that you admired in Peter Gabriel. I think a lot of people would really hesitate sort of reaching out to someone that they sort of hold in high regard and high esteem. But you just sort of did it, and as a result of just sort of taking that step and sort of being fearless, actually sort of ended up being his assistant, which is incredible. And the other thing as well, I think, is that you sort of self-taught. I think it's always quite reaffirming when you hear about people who sort of haven't had necessarily sort of like done a master's in music or sort of studied composition, but that passion for music and sort of and visuals, and actually being able to just sort of marry the two up based on sort of like a natural intuition and instinct. I think it's probably reassuring for anybody who is listening that doesn't have, because I find it reassuring myself, because I'm sort of, again, sort of self-taught. And actually, I think there's quite a few of us people who've interviewed on the podcast as well who haven't had that official training, but it just goes to show that, with the dedication and sort of applying the craft, that you can actually get really good at, if you can't be good doing something that you're passionate about, what can you be good at? Just something you mentioned as well is that you said your sort of dad was very much into science. Was there ever sort of any sort of resistance from your parents in terms of maybe sort of going into a career based in sort of sound or music? Was there sort of like, well, no, you need to sort of do science or a proper job? Or were they sort of supportive of a career in the arts?
It's a good question. They weren't. Well, I felt under a lot of pressure being a woman and being not being white, to go down a certain road of following a certain stereotypical career path, because I actually have a degree in mathematics, so I felt under sort of peer pressure to go into being an accountant or a maths teacher or an actuary,
a proper job,
a normal 9-to-5 proper job. And of course, I just thought I wanted to follow my passion. And so I sort of tricked my parents into saying, look, this is a 5-year plan. I've got a degree. I can always fall back on it. And thankfully, I never went on to my backup plan B. But they didn't dissuade me, but they were always, even now, they say, when are you going to get a real job? It's a classic.
Hopefully by now they kind of sort of have the confidence that...
I think, they've given up on me, I think.
It's difficult, though, because I think, I sort of relate to it, because I think growing up, a career in music or within the arts was never presented to me as a viable career path. So to step into that, you're going into the unknown. It's an area, a world that a lot of people don't understand, and therefore sort of have a lot of reservations about. So, but at the same time, absolutely worth it, and absolutely worth sticking to your guns and following that passion.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important. I actually wanted to, as a teenager, when I went to my careers department in school, I had to pick a career that I was most suited to. And I actually discovered the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which had actually disbanded at the time. I was a bit too young for that, but I wanted to work at the BBC as a studio manager, but I couldn't get in. I was very interested in working in the media, and I thought, well, you need to have physics and maths and music, and it was a really interesting combination of skill sets that you required, and that didn't work. But that was always my dream to, I loved Doctor Who as a child, and I loved television theme tunes, so that was a potential official way into the industry, if you like, but it didn't work out like that. I didn't have physics, so I couldn't get in.
And I suppose this is something we should probably just clear up as well, is sort of like, so if you were offered Star Trek or Star Wars, it sounds like you would go Star Trek.
Oh, well, I did love Star Wars as a kid as well. So that's a very tough one, Jim. I don't think I can decide between the two. I think, both really.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. That's fine. It's stay on the fence. It's always dangerous picking one camp or the other, because you sort of risk upsetting people. There was a friend showed me there was a crossword clue in the New York Times recently, where the clue was the world's biggest or the world's favourite space TV franchise or whatever, and that you could either put Star Trek or Star Wars. Both of them worked. They'd engineered all the sort of like other clues so that you could write either. But I think I would probably I'd have to err on the side of Star Wars. I did enjoy particularly Star Trek Next Generation. Captain Picard will always have a very special place in my heart.
I love Picard. And I actually, my dad used to watch the original Star Trek.
Right,
so
William
I think,
Shatner.
Yeah, maybe I'm edging towards Star Trek, I think. Because Star Trek Next Generation was wonderful and Picard was great. I have a soft spot for him. And, of course, William Shatner, just loved it. Yeah.
And what about, just because you mentioned Star Wars as well, do you feel like, do you remember being struck by the score for Star Wars, by John Williams' score?
Yeah, very much so. I think it was probably of John Williams and, my early memories. It was E.T. and Close Encounters. I think Close Encounters was a big one. And Jaws and Duel, but of Spielberg's movies. But Close Encounters was just Richard Dreyfuss's performance, and the whole story and the concept of astronomy and science. That really grabbed me, and then followed by E.T., of course, and then loving the adventurous side, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and all of those I think informed me as a kid, and going to the cinema and watching Bond movies. I loved the Bond scores and John Barry's scores, so I'm very much a child of those Bond movies in the 80s, and Sean Connery and Roger Moore, and the music really informed me. Melody is something that I miss. I mean, melody's still around. People are writing melodic scores, but there's also this duality of over the last 10-15 years of non-melodic scores as well, because of the way that we use technology that's opened up the world of using synths and textures and so on, and also I think as a result why we don't have so much melody for certain types of films is because directors want to sit on the fence emotionally, and don't want to be so bold with the music sometimes, I think.
It's funny that you mentioned this, because this came up as well. I was talking with Isabel Waller-Bridge about this, and about the idea that a lot of modern film score is much more reliant on atonal drones, and is much less melodic. And I think I think growing up in the 80s there was so much fantastic melody, even within TV. In the episode with Andrew Stannard, we sort of were talking about incredible TV programs, like there was Quantum Leap, there was the A-Team, they had even the cartoon Thundercats had the most phenomenal theme tunes, which just sort of like, it wasn't music for children, it was incredible pieces of music which were part and parcel of a TV show. And I think that as well means that we have a love for melody, which there isn't quite the same room for, in the same way that you might be able to sort of easily sing Superman or Star Wars, although actually a lot of people struggle to differentiate between the two, and Indiana Jones and things like that. Nowadays, people would be hard pushed to sort of sing the Avengers theme tune or the Iron Man theme tune or Spider-Man, because it's just not there in the same way. And there's, some people posit the idea the temp track is part of the problem for that, because people sort of use a temp track, the director becomes attached to it, and then anything other than that temp track. But it's interesting. I love your idea that people don't want to commit emotionally, and that's why they go for something which is a bit more sort of
textural it is interesting. I love animations. I was watching Encanto recently, and I grew up, again, I also, having loved Barbra Streisand, I grew up loving musicals, and Stephen Sondheim and early Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, and using song and melody to reach people emotionally. You can ask the man or woman in the street, sing your favorite theme tune or film score, and I think they did that with Marvel, didn't they? There was and people couldn't hum a Marvel tune, and but give them John Barry or give them John Williams, and yes, they can you have that. Ennio Morricone, the first album that was ever LP that was ever given to me as a present was my mother bought the spaghetti westerns, fistful of dollars and for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that was just mind-blowing for me, using this very unusual palette of sounds and the inventiveness of Morricone and his scores. And it still stands up today, and we have that immediate recall and connection. You go, yes, he invented a whole musical genre, so textures, I think, because of the way that technology has improved, and samples and synthesizers and so on, it's just, there are many different ways of climbing the mountain. I'm not saying that you can't have an effective score without a melody, but there's room for all of that. And I think that's what's it enriches us and is so nourishing, with the vast array of palette of sounds we have at our fingertips now, that it can also, though, work adversely and complicates things so much. So when I first started composing, I only had a handful of synths. It's all I could afford. I had a couple of synth modules, an EMU Proteus and a Roland synth D7T, which was, I saved up all my pocket money for it, and a Yamaha TG77 synth module and so on. And I had a tiny, we didn't even have hard disk recording. I just had, it was pure MIDI. And I would restrict my palette of sounds and just work with the limited resources that I had. Now I actually find it more cumbersome to compose because I've got millions of sounds at my fingertips. Sound libraries come out; they're relatively cheap, and I've got a room full of instruments and synths, as you can see behind me, and so I don't know where to begin. So at the beginning of every project, going into process, I guess, is I will restrict myself and give myself some parameters and go, right, I'm only going to write this score using my collection of Jews harps,
Yes, okay.
and one violin, and then just work within that. Obviously branch out when I need to, and stray from that to have a little bit more variety. But just creating parameters is it's so healthy and good.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like almost that by restricting yourself, you're actually freeing yourself, because you don't then sort of have this sort of end up going down the wormhole of, I've got thousands and thousands of different VSTs or instruments to play with. Yeah. So how do I choose one? It's just like, just pick one and use that, and then build out from there.
Yeah. And the same thing with temp tracks, when I actually embrace, I know a lot of composers, we're using temp tracks and reference tracks all the time. And that the problem with that is that when your score is temped with 10 different Hollywood scores, all written by the top LA composers, you just end up sounding like that. And so that's why it's quite incestuous, and why so many Hollywood scores all sound like one another, because you're given very little freedom to sort of move away from that. And then you're also having to work to, within the politics of execs and teams, and following people's expectations and what they expect to hear within a certain musical genre, within a certain film genre. If you're doing a rom-com, you have to sound like this. If you're doing a Hollywood crime thriller, you need to sound like a cross between 5 or 6 other composers and their scores that have all set a precedent. So it's a challenge to break away from that and create a new precedent, and create something that no one's ever heard before. That's it's getting harder and harder, because there's so much music out there. So it is an interesting landscape to work in at the moment.
Under the skin. And so how do you approach that in terms of, so a project comes in, what's your sort of thought process? What are you thinking in terms of, okay, how can I bring a bit of unique flavour to this? How can I take this, into a sort of slightly interesting area? Like you were saying before, sometimes there's an aversion to sort of risk, and everything sort of tends to sound quite homogenous. How do you approach that?
Well, I mean, if we're looking at 14 Peaks as an example, compared to The Reason I Jump, which is another recent film, which is very different in the way I approach them. With 14 Peaks, it was a little bit more conventional, that I'm very much led by the director's vision, because ultimately I'm having to serve the director's vision and, creative sort of conceptual approach. So with that, the editor and I sort of work with the Holy Trinity, which is the director, the editor, and the composer, and we work very closely together. So with 14 Peaks, the director and the editor had a strong vision. They had actually laid in various temp reference tracks and were editing around it. And I came in halfway through the edit, and I thought, and they were giving me sequences to score to, which was a very big, epic symphonic score. And the reason for that, it worked with the scale and the epic nature of the story anyway. So it seemed right to go down a symphonic approach for that. But in terms of making it a little bit more unique and distinctive, it is set in the Himalayas. So, and in these, this inhospitable, hostile region. So I did bring in little touches of Nepalese musical elements here and there to blend in with the orchestra, which was a lot of fun. Trying to bring it in a subtle way, as opposed to banging the audience over the head with it. I always love to throw a twist on conventional music approaches. So that it's not pure. I mean, there's a lot of sound design elements in the score as well. So I'm bringing in my experience as a sound designer and working with the landscape. There isn't a huge amount of music in the film. It's about 50 minutes of music, and it doesn't. You're not bombarded with it. So there's big music when it needs there to be. But I'm also, when I'm scoring, it's important to me to craft the score so that you're taking the audience on an emotional journey with the music as much as the filmmaker is taking you on an emotional journey as well. So that there are sometimes you just hear sparse drones because you just want to hear the sound of the crunch of the feet on the snow. And, when I was a sound designer, being able to tell a story through sound is as important as working with the ebb and flow of the music as well. So everything works hand in hand, so you make space for music. In some scenes music will lead, and in other scenes the sound design will lead. So in that regard, I'm not that precious about my music. It's all about everything interweaving together with the images and the story to take you as an audience on this fantastic adventure and journey from the start to the finish.
Can you just give us a brief synopsis, Nainita, just because for anyone who's not seen it, just a brief synopsis of what it's about?
Yeah, so 14 Peaks is it's about Nims Purja, of this fearless, fun-loving Nepali climber on this quest, which is called Project Possible, to summit all 14 of the world's 8,000 meters mountains in just 3 months. In fact, he did it in... he did it in less than 7 months. Sorry, to do it in 7 months, yeah.
And previously it had taken the previous person to do that 7 years to do it.
Yeah.
To give some context, so he's done in 7 months what the previous victor had taken 7 years to do, which is just phenomenal. So
the idea was he took his team of skilled Sherpas, because he's Nepalese himself, and they climb Mount Everest, K2, and all the other iconic peaks through these incredibly inhospitable climate, issues, problems that were had. While he was climbing the mountains, he was also saving people's lives, which is just unbelievable. And so he's ended up as he's a real hero, a real life hero.
And didn't he also climbed Mount Everest the night before? Him and his Sherpas had been out on the town till sort of like 6 a.m, so they hadn't slept. They were hungover, and they still scaled Everest. I
mean, he's quite he lives life to the full. And I spent the weekend with him at Kendal Film Festival, which is the European premiere of the film, and he does love to party, but he's also an amazing human being. He brings people together. He has this incredible ability to bring people together and is very warm and welcoming, and he's got a big heart. And one big motivating factor for him to doing this is that he has this beautiful relationship. He had this beautiful relationship and bond with his mother, and that was a big motivating factor for him. And sadly, his mother passes away, but not before she was there to see him succeed. And so at the end of the film, there's this big emotional moment where he reunites with his mother, and I wrote a piece of music for them called Mother and Son. And the whole film is thrilling. It's action-packed. It's about courage and perseverance and pushing the limits of human endurance. And so the music, I felt, had to match that scale. It had to have danger and love and humanity and drama and tragedy and intimacy and heroism as well. So it's very inspiring, and it was very inspiring for me to work on the film. I'm glad I was in the warmth of my studio while working on it. I mean, I was on the project for about 5 or 6 months, and I felt cold in my studio working on it.
What were some of the sound designy elements that you built in? Because I was going to ask you, because I was very interested the fact that you started there, and then I think that's a great position, because that blurring the line between music and sound design is something that I love to do. So, were there any specific things you can tell us from 14 Peaks that you put in there?
Well, I worked with the sound designer in so much as, worked with the director and the editor to work out what was going to take lead. Sometimes you'd hear the crunch, the wind, and when they reach the summit of a mountain. I mean, there are 14 mountains to climb. And so I wanted each mountain to have its own musical journey as well, as opposed to let's have a big epic piece of music. We reach the peak, we bring it down. Okay, another peak, another peak, another peak. It would be a bit boring. So sometimes we'd have. I think there's some couple of dramatic moments that they cover with animation. That's really exciting. And so I sort of twisted and contorted a lot of sort of sound design elements. Took the sound of the snow sometimes and morphed that into the music. I took some throat singing from Mongolia and Central Asia and wound that into the score, and took some plucked stringed instruments that I integrated into some of the cues as well, just here and there. But the real sound design work came on my other project, actually, where I really interwove the two together with music and sound on The Reason I Jump, which is a really interesting project in terms of where I really got to shine with and bring in my roots as a sound designer.
Mm. And you implied as well earlier that did you have a bit more sort of creative freedom within The Reason I Jump in terms of trying to find something a little bit unique and a unique flavour?
Yes. So I mean, with just going back to 14 Peaks, that was very much the sound palette and the sonic world, and the approach musically was very much led by the director and the editor on that. And then me working with them very closely, cue by cue and scene by scene. But with The Reason I Jump, it was very much a kind of an open book, and it was more daunting. It was a huge project in that regard, because I worked on that film for about 15 months, and I got brought on board at a very early stage. The one thing I did have to go on was the book, the original book upon which the film is based, which is The Reason I Jump, written by a 13-year-old Japanese non-verbal autistic boy at the time. It's about 13 years ago. And it's about neurodiversity, and it's about how he sees the world as an autistic person in a very multi-sensory way. So the aim was to invoke the intense sensory worlds of the book using score and sound design. Not just with visual images. With the cinematography is incredible, and as a composer I'm very visually led, I'm very visually inspired. You put images in front of me and I'll know what to do for it, whether it be a mountain or a close-up of a daffodil, for example, or and
so you would never start coming up with ideas based off of the book or the script. You'd want to see something visual first.
No, well, I mean, normally I get sent images, But with The Reason I Jump, it was the reverse. Because I got brought on so early, and had only they'd been filming interviews, but none of the creative, hyper-realistic, beautiful imagery that you see in the film. So I did a lot of research to try and dive in and find a way into the film, to find a concept, and I had lots of conversations with the director and the editor, and there are various things in autism that I wanted to translate, aspects of autism that I wanted to translate into music. So, for example, autistic people, and this is a big generalization, I can't speak, because neurodiversity is so wide-ranging and everyone experiences it in a different way. But with the characters in the film who are autistic, one of the characters rocks backwards and forwards a lot, and it's a form of catharsis for her. So and there are autistic people also respond to repetition and circular movements a lot. So to translate that into music, I thought I would create loops, and the idea of repetitiveness within the music to evoke that feeling. Neurodiverse people are very susceptible and perceptive to sound in the environment around them. So that's one of the big reasons why I took a lot of found sound from the film sound and crafted it into musical pieces to blur the lines between the sound in the film and the music that I would create. So, for example, there's one major scene in the film early on where you've got one of the characters rocking backwards and forwards to the movement of this ceiling fan and table fans, and so the sound designer and the director gave me those sounds, and I actually took little fragments of them and did use a lot of granular synthesis and experimenting with plugins and effects, and chopped it up and created little loops out of those elements, and then out of that would grow a piece of music. So in terms of restricting my palette, which we talked about 20 minutes ago, I said to myself, okay, I'm not going to create any music using synthesizers or electronic sounds. Everything is going to be created using the found sound from the film and my human voice, because these characters are non-verbal, they don't speak. And I wanted to give the characters a voice to represent their internal voice. So I did a lot of singing within the film, and I took my own voice and created musical cues out of it. So there's some of the characters, they only communicate through letterboarding techniques. So they'll have an alphabet board in front of them, and they will point to letters on this keyboard. And a little bit, if you imagine the way Stephen Hawking has communicated, you'll press a key and it will come up with a sound of that letter. A, I, ta, ko, a, sa, ma, a, pa. And so on the screen in the film, you'll see when they do this a few times, it comes up with letters coming up on the screen. So I actually sing the letters that are coming up in the musical cues, and out of that grows a piece of music. So we experimented a lot with those and I layered my voice. So at the opening titles, when the title of the film comes up, The Reason I Jump, I actually sing the letters, the I jump, and it's and the way, another aspect of autism is that autistic people see the detail in objects before they see the whole picture. So if you walk into a room as a neurotypical person, I'm not autistic, so I will come into a room and I will see the whole room in front of me before I'll focus in on something like a bunch of flowers or a light bulb or something. Whereas it's the opposite with autistic people. They will zone in immediately on little details in objects, the spinning of a wheel or the buzz of a light bulb flickering, and so I wanted to bring that out in the music somehow. And so I created a lot of detailed fragments of, it's like piecing a jigsaw puzzle together. You see all these fragmented, disconnected elements, which I had in a piece of music. And then somehow those little musical fragments would come together to form a whole. And so some of the cues in the score reflect that and mirror that. And authenticity is very important to me. So when composing and being true to the story. So I found this cellist who's actually autistic herself. And she plays cello for the London Philharmonic Orchestra, but she's also the cultural ambassador for the National Autistic Society in the UK. So she came to my studio and played the cello for me, and I got a very personal, sensitive response to the music from her to hear how she perceives the world around her. So that was very emotional and moving for me and for her as a contributor to the film score.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think that authenticity that you talk about is kind of one of those sort of intangibles which people won't be able to recognize, but they'll be able to feel on some level. Like we were talking before we started recording about the score for Sama, and that you found a sort of Syrian violinist, and the fact that sort of that provides the sort of textural backdrop for, people wouldn't know that there's a Syrian violinist playing that, but there's something in the way that person plays and the sound of that instrument which has an authenticity to it. And similarly, with an autistic cellist, they would just have a unique approach to playing their instrument that, as you say, a neurotypical person wouldn't. And Stephen Warbeck talks about this as well, actually, in terms of it's not just about selecting the instrument, but as much about selecting who plays the instrument, because there's certain nuances and idiosyncrasies will come through on a very subtle level, but they are there.
Yes, it's something that I've learned, from working with Peter Gabriel, the way that he brings out the best in the musicians that he chooses, is very, when I like a director will cast their actors for a role, I almost kind of cast my musicians for a project. So I'm very particular, and I'll do a lot of research, and I like to make the invisible visible, over the years, when I've worked on projects requiring, I love working with specialist musicians and bringing in musicians who are not known to the world of film and television, which is it's new for them and it's new for me, and we get a really fresh result. But also, like with For Sama, I found, and authenticity, in the film you have the crumbling city of Aleppo all around you, which has been, bombing and shelling going on, and the whole city's crumbling around you. And with the music, with the violinist, I didn't want a pure Western classical instrument, which was a very clean, pure sound. I wanted an authenticity where the sound that the musician made mirrored the crumbling city of Aleppo. It had a roar and a grit and an edge to it that wasn't pure and clean, and that sort of aesthetic that I bring to the musical contributions with my musicians is very subliminal, and it affects the audience in a subliminal way, and they don't know why. They hear it, and yet, it just has this subtle influence on you when you're listening to it. It all forms part of the whole.
Yeah. And with those musicians, is it a case of writing a part and giving it to the musician, or do you sometimes bring the musician in and sort of have them explore the instrument and have that inform where you go creatively?
Well, with The Reason I Jump, again, that process was very unconventional because I was brought on so early. I actually brought in musicians very early on. I wrote sketches using samples, and then I would bring in musicians, and sometimes I would just sing them lines, with world musicians who don't read music. I'm often singing lines and singing parts to them. And it's very much this organic sparking off each other process where, with The Reason I Jump, with 14 Peaks, it was quite conventional in that I did all my mock-ups and in Logic, and then at the end of the process, when all the music had been approved, I recorded the score at Abbey Road, and I brought in the London Contemporary Orchestra, and we did a whole day's recording, and then I edited it, mixed the score, delivered it, and that's how normal scores work traditionally. But with The Reason I Jump, it was very much toing and froing and writing lots and lots of ideas, lots of tracks, doing semi-experimental, semi-improvised recording sessions. So I kind of knew what I was going into the session with, where I wrote lots of sketches and ideas. But then sometimes I would have no idea what we'd end up doing in the session, so okay, here are a few set of parameters, and then so for example with Elizabeth Wicklander, the cellist, the autistic cellist, I did this piece of music. I had a blank slate. I had no idea what we were doing, and so I made it up on the spot, and I said to her, okay, we're going to record a cello line, and I'm going to give you 5 notes, and you can only play those 5 notes, and when I point my finger upwards, you will go up a tone. When I point my finger downwards, you'll go down a tone, and we did that for about a minute and a half, and we recorded 1 line. I thought, okay, let's do another one. And so I played back the first take, and we did it again. And I was sort of feeding off. It was almost like generative music. It was, the piece was evolving, and a sort of layer after layer after layer. And we did about 7 or 8 takes of cello with only those certain notes being played. And it was like waves of cello playing, and this great thick texture that was undulating, and it was really, really interesting. And then on top of that, I would then carry on developing it, and so that was very slightly experimental. I brought in a clarinetist and she and a saxophonist, and we did sort of circular breathing techniques with the saxophone to mirror the feeling of repetition and looping in autism. So it was like he was doing this throat techniques, where he's sort of breathing in and out, you're creating this amazing wave of saxophone playing, and a bit like Colin Stetson and his score for Hereditary, which I just loved, so that was the original inspiration for bringing in a sax player and using instruments where you're using the human breath as a musical sound, not just vocals and singing, but using instruments like the woodwind where you're using the human breath to create noise as well.
I suppose it lends itself very well to a horror score, because obviously that heightened sense of fear and emotion, and the sort of like the deepening of the breath, and actually the sound of heavy breathing in of itself can actually be quite evocative. You mentioned the track where you were sort of slowly adding the cello lines. Is there a particular cue on the score that people can listen to if they want to sort of hear an example of that?
Yes, but I can't remember which one it is on the score, so you're going to have to listen to the whole score.
You have to listen to the whole score. Okay. Well, I will do a bit of research after this, and I'll sort of all the music that we've mentioned throughout this, I'll be linking to in the show notes, so people can go and have easy access to sort of go and listen to stuff.
It's funny because I write all these pieces, and then when it comes to the actual soundtrack, I sort of tend to rename all the pieces and give them something much more eloquent and indicative of
rather
what it is.
Q1 V10 or Q2 B/7.
Yes. Boy walks across field. It's not very inspiring.
Getting a taste. As creatives, we're always sort of very influenced by the music that we've been exposed to growing up, and we've already established that you're a massive Barbra Streisand fan. Are there other kind of particular kind of, and this isn't just film scores, it can be sort of albums as well and music, but particular albums, particular pieces of music, particular film scores which you can sort of track back through your formative years that you think have hugely informed how you create today?
When I grew up, my first major awareness of film and TV music, TV music, I loved TV theme tunes growing up, I sort of Doctor Who and of course Star Trek and John Williams scores and Tales of the Unexpected, Roald Dahl's, and children's TV tunes, Blue Peter and Grange Hill and
Sesame Street,
yeah, and so I was always a hummer. My ears would perk up with TV themes, and that was a major influence on me. Grandstand sports, and I can still sing them now, these earworms in my head. And in terms of film scores, I think it was for film and the music combined, because I was a major film buff. I remember when I was 18, I think as a late teen, when I was at university, I was introduced to the French New Wave of Luc Besson and Nikita and the Big Blue and Betty Blue. Gabriel Yared's score for Betty Blue just blew me away. And again, it was melodies. And as a really young kid, Ennio Morricone, of course, John Williams. And I was very much into the French New Wave, all those Gabriel Yared, Michel Legrand scores. I remember seeing Pi because I have a degree in mathematics. And so I went to see the film Pi by Darren Aronofsky in the cinema. And the score just was incredible. It was written by Clint Mansell. And I think it was the first score that he wrote, actually.
Is Pi the film, is it about a mathematician, or is he autistic as well?
I can't remember now, but yes, it's about mathematics. So it was a combination of all those things, and even Peter Greenaway's films and The Draftsman's Contract. Music was written by Michael Nyman, and that score was very influenced by Purcell, but the combination of sounds and music and the story was really special. And then moving on from that, I love Thomas Newman's scores. I love that emotional ambiguity that he has. And I think one particular score of his that I really, really has resonated with me is Revolutionary Road. It's an incredible score, more so than American Beauty, I think, for which he's really known. As a teen, I liked Trevor Jones's music, writing the music when he wrote his scores for, what was it? The Last of the Mohicans and The Sea of Love, which is this smaller movie with Al Pacino and Ellen Barkin. And I remember going to my local library when we had libraries, and they had a soundtrack department in Putney Library. So I used to borrow all the soundtracks on LP and then make my own bootleg tapes of those soundtracks at home.
Obviously, if the authorities are listening, you've long since got rid of them and paid the relevant royalties.
The Conversation, Francis Ford Coppola's Walter Murch was a big hero of mine. He's this legendary picture editor, but he was also a dubbing mixer. And so David Shire's music for The Conversation, which is just on a piano theme, is really powerful. It's all about, because I was sort of geeking out on recording technology and music engineering and sound design. And so that film is really, really, it's all about covert spies and tape recording and listening in. And so I was really interested in... I really loved films that are about con artists and scam artists and spies, and a bit like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and, The Conversation and those Cold War movies, spy movies. I really loved those at the time as well. And so recently I've just in the last few weeks, I've been watching Inside Anna on Netflix, which is just, I love it. It's fantastic. I'm just really binge watching that at the moment.
Yeah, it's a touchy subject for me because my wife has gone and watched that on her own. She didn't wait for me because we were going to watch it together. So,
well, had I not been a composer, because of my degree in maths, and I was really into code breaking and spies, I would, if I'd gone back in time, if I were born in the 1930s, I think I'd probably been a code breaker at Bletchley Park. It would
have been you, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
it would have been you to solve the code.
Because they employed women as well. They had female mathematicians. So I really, I love the beauty of numbers and sort of incorporating that into my musical compositions sometimes.
And it's interesting as well because you mentioned that sort of. It sounded like almost a sort of a love for the technical side of things, and because I think sometimes there's a sort of split, a dichotomy. You've got the sort of purely sort of creative elements and just sort of creating in its purest sense, but then there's the other sort of part of the brain which is all about kind of like the tech and the mechanics. And it sounds like because you were sort of a mathematician and because you were sort of, your dad was very much into science, that sort of that's influenced you in the world of sampling and possibly opened up the doors, because I think today as a modern composer, if you're not technically minded, it's actually very difficult. The days of sitting down with a piece of parchment and a quill and sort of writing out your score is sort of long gone. You need to be able to sort of almost produce all the finished article as a demo in order to sort of get the gig.
Yes, because I mean I don't have a degree in music and I'm not formally trained, so my way into musical composition was through technology. And I think if I'd have been born 20, 30 years earlier, I probably wouldn't be a composer. I would have gone into architecture as something, it was like tossing and turning between, shall I study, I love architecture and I love the creation, the combination, the fusion between creativity and music in this case and technology, whether it be the visual medium, being artistic and drawing, because I loved, art at school as well. And I would draw and paint. And so using drawing and then applying it to a very, to precision and detail and mathematical accuracy, but allowing having emotional fluidity as well and connecting with people emotionally. So with whatever form of art there is, I like that symbiosis of the two where things can work in harmony together. I'm really into MIDI controllers, so I bought. I was a big investor in the Roley Seaboards, which and I love that. Being able to connect between the musical chaos and creativity in my mind and being able to reach out and get it out very quickly using technology in a very intuitive, organic way. And the Roley Seaboard does that so well. It's bridging the gap between the ideas that we have and not having to endlessly spend hours programming it and finessing it and fine tuning. Though I love that side. I love music editing and audio editing anyway.
Well, it's interesting because it's that human side of things. It's that ability to perform, play an instrument without really thinking about it allows you to sort of imbue it with emotion. So I think sometimes that's where technology can actually be quite restrictive, because if you're working to a click track and its grid, or you're programming something in a less than intuitive manner, being able to allowing that intuitive process. It was funny, I was having a conversation just yesterday with a group of writers that I work with, and saying like, look, step outside the box, play some percussion yourself, tap the back of a guitar rather than sort of going for a sort of a kick drum in the box. Tap a guitar and do a take where it's you playing along, because those sort of slight inaccuracies is what gives it rise to the sort of human element to it. And because in the box, everything tends to be just a bit too clinical and a little bit too perfect. And actually what we as humans love is the sort of the imperfections. And this is, again, is something that keeps coming up in a lot of the interviews, is this sort of this idea. But you mentioned obviously sort of looking at the visuals, and you mentioned the sort of like some of the musical influences. I think what was very interesting earlier, what you were talking about as well, is actually your creative process begins even before you're sort of touching instruments. You're sort of thinking, when you were talking about The Reason I Jump, you were looking at, okay, what is the world like of a non-neurotypical person? How do I try and sort of capture that? And that's before you've even sort of started looking at sounds. Are there other areas that you will sort of, other than sort of music and visuals, that you will perhaps, I mean, you mentioned a love of architecture, but are there other places that you go to sort of draw inspiration that aren't sort of specifically musical or televisual, so to speak?
Funny enough, if I'm trying to write melodies, I tend to do them. I tend to sing them first. If I can make it work vocally, then it has a fluidity and a feeling that it's much more natural, as opposed to trying to hammer away on the keyboard. And so a lot of my melodies, I hear pieces in my head away from the studio. So sometimes the best way for me to be creative is to not be in the studio, because I find that being in the studio means that, of course, I'm in the studio many hours a day, all the time when I'm composing, but the initial spark of ideas will come away when I'm going for a walk, or, if I'm food shopping in the supermarket or in the shower, and so I'll always have my phone with me, and I'll sing little melodies into my phone, and then I'll come back into the studio and the next day, and if I think it's still good, then it's worth pursuing and developing further, or not.
Yeah, definitely. That's a little trick I use quite a lot. Is I will come up with several different melodic ideas, and then I'll come back the following day and listen to them with fresh ears. And normally there's one which will sort of stand out as the winner. And weirdly, my inspiration tends to strike while I'm having my lunch. I was sort of having my lunch, and then I'll have to drop it to sort of get my phone and sort of like sing in an idea. There's something happens maybe with food. I don't know.
Food and music, yes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Two most important things in life.
Yeah.
Incredible. Well, Nainita, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sort of sharing. There's so much inspirational stuff there.
Yeah, we haven't got onto all the other questions, but never mind. My favourite film, my favourite TV show, but it's only so much.
I'll go on then quickly. What if you were to be stranded on a desert island and you only had one film to take with you? What would it be?
A film? Oh gosh, I do like. In recent years, I love The Favourite by Yorgos Lanthimos, and also Celine Sciamma's film Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which just was incredible when I first saw it.
So you're only allowed one. Which are you going to take?
The Favourite.
Okay. Obviously, you're on a desert island, but you do have the means to play video, because obviously it'd be just a bit rubbish if you were sat at that with a DVD.
But,
and what about an album, a sort of musical album, if you were to have a musical accompaniment to The Favourite?
I guess a big turning point for me when I was growing up was, I love Bach. I love so many different styles of music, from classical to, contemporary. But I think Peter Gabriel's The Last Temptation of Christ was a seminal album which changed. It ended up as temp music on so many scores for so many composers after that. But in terms of television, I have to say I binged watch and love Succession. I think it's an incredible. It's and the score as well by Nicholas Britell, and I've been listening to his latest score for Don't Look Up on Netflix, which is wonderful, really, really great. Yeah.
Well, again, I'll link to all of those in the show notes. Let's just finish up then with a couple of quick fire questions. What's your favourite biscuit?
My favourite biscuit, ginger snaps.
Ginger snap, excellent choice. What's a little known fact about Nainita Desai?
I'm very much an introvert. a lot of people think that I'm not, because I seem to be very social, but it's not really a little known fact. There's nothing about me is hidden. I'm just.
Well, I wouldn't have guessed. Were you always an introvert, or is that?
I was always an introvert. I started off as a very, very shy wallflower, and it took me a long time to develop and grow. It made me, I thought, I'm going to have to eat more than beans on toast, so I need to get out of my shell more. And
okay, what scares you?
The dark.
The dark, literally, that you're scared
Yeah,
of
I
the
do
dark?
get a little bit scared of the dark. If I wake up at 3 a.m. and going to the bathroom at 3 a.m. in the morning, walking down the corridor, I sometimes see things that shouldn't be there.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I do get afraid of the dark a little bit. Yeah.
And if you could go back in time, what advice would you give your younger self?
To be, well, it's not just about the music. Of course, writing, developing your skill set with technology is crucial. Your musical skills. Learn instruments. It's invaluable these days to be able to have an instrument to your bow, like, whether it's the violin or the cello or the guitar or any instrument. I think it's really useful. And also getting out there, being social. It took me a long time. I'm a late developer. It took me a long time to realize that it's not just about writing great music, which is taken for granted, because the technology allows us all to write music of a certain standard now. But developing your own voice, finding your own voice, being unique and distinctive from other composers out there, that is more important now than ever before, because it's such a competitive, saturated marketplace. What makes you stand out from other composers in your music and you as a human being? And also to live life. There's more to life than just composing 20 hours a day. You've got to get out and live, because it nourishes us. Everything feeds in on everything else. And so, I love to travel. For example, it's been hard the last 2 years, but I do travel, and just getting out there and experiencing life and having relationships, friends, and nurturing human relationships of all different forms is so important to us, for it to feed into who we are as musicians and composers and human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very, very poignant sort of note to end on. Incredible. Well, thank you so much. Obviously, if people want to listen to you or watch the films and listen to the scores, they're all available on Spotify, and obviously 14 Peaks is on Netflix. For Sama is on Channel 4. The Reason I Jump, where can people watch that?
That's coming...
That's still under wraps?
That's out, I think, on... that's coming in April to Disney+.
And that is 2022. So for anyone who's listening in the future, obviously you'll already know that. But it's
if you're in the States, it's out on Netflix in the US, and it is available on iTunes and on other platforms to purchase as well, Amazon and so on.
And are you active on social media? Can people find you?
I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Right. So. And what are your handles on those platforms if people want to find you?
Just my name, Nainita Desai, I think.
Okay.
So it shouldn't be difficult to find me.
Yeah, brilliant. All right, Nainita, well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Thank you, Jim. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really lovely to chat. And thank you for your questions that dig in.
Yeah, it's always fascinating. I'm always fascinated by the people in the process. So and good luck with everything that's to come. And say hello to Stephen Warbeck if you see him in France.
I will. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larkmusic.com. Larkmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larkmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.